So I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Foreign Minister, the Honourable Julie Bishop, who's just returned from the AUSMIN meeting in Boston, and not long before that, the important September leaders meeting in the UN in New York. I'm not going to say anything more because you have the bio in your packs, and I think we want to leave as much time for the Minister to speak, and then she will answer questions. So welcome, the Honourable Julie Bishop.
Good morning. My apologies for the short delay. I have just returned from Boston and Washington, but via Sydney, Perth, and now back to Canberra, in that order. Distinguished guests, ambassadors, my colleague, the Honourable Bronwyn Bishop, ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today among so many respected names in foreign affairs. The Australian Institute of International Affairs is one of our nation's premier think tanks and contributes a great deal to the development and dissemination of ideas and debates on foreign policy, and I'm sure this year's national conference will take its reputation to even greater heights. The theme today is a deliberate challenge to a room full of strongly held opinions: Australian foreign policy, regional or global. The simple answer, of course, is that we do not have the luxury of choice, nor should we choose. We must actively pursue an approach that advances and deepens our interests in all spheres. The relative focus given to regional or global issues which are overlapping is driven by our ability to either shape events or respond to events beyond our control. Australia is more than a middle power. Ours is a significant voice in international affairs. We are a top 20 nation in virtually all social and economic indicators that reflect the status and values of nations. As the 12th largest economy in the world, our GDP is ahead of Russia, Spain, Mexico, Indonesia, the Netherlands, and Turkey. On a per capita basis, we are the 5th largest. We are one of the most prosperous, safe, open, free, and democratic countries in the world. Australia has an overwhelming interest in contributing to a global order that is peaceful and stable, a consistent, rules-based world order that operates in a way that allows us to support our values, our interests. We tend to be internationalist in pursuit of our values, regionalist in terms of our interests, bilateralist as a priority, and the focus we give to each is shaped and nuanced by the challenges, opportunities, and circumstances we face. I've been using the term Indo-Pacific to describe our region, for we are a continent straddled by two of the world's great oceans, the Indian and the Pacific, a description which encompasses the countries of Asia. The transformation of the Indo-Pacific in recent decades has been nothing short of remarkable. It's also been fundamental to the development of our national economy. Japan emerged as an economic powerhouse in the second half of the 20th century, and the Japan-Australia relationship became our most comprehensive in the region. For many decades, Japanese investment has been and continues to be particularly crucial to the development of Australia's resources sector. The subsequent rapid growth of the South Korean economy was also significant. It is now our 4th largest trading partner. China's industrialisation, on a scale and at a pace never seen before in human history, has not only lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, it has had significant flow-on effects for the region and the world. Today, China is the world's 2nd largest economy and our largest two-way trading partner. Indeed, China is oft-cited as the largest merchandise trading partner of at least 100 countries, probably more like 120 countries across the globe. Within the next 2 decades, India's economy is expected to surpass Japan's to become the world's 3rd largest, from 9th largest today. Southeast Asia's tiger economies, particularly Indonesia, Vietnam and Malaysia, are growing almost as quickly. Already a vibrant democracy, Indonesia is tipped to have the fourth largest economy by mid-century. With its increasing economic heft, Indonesia will inevitably play a greater leadership role in the region in the future, and with even closer cooperation between our two neighbouring countries, we can help build greater regional prosperity and security. Economic and social development has never been a linear process, and there will be setbacks along the way, particularly as nations strive to avoid the so-called middle-income trap. The regional economy is at a critical juncture in 2015. China's economy is transitioning from an export-led model to one increasingly being driven by domestic consumption and services. This is likely to be a challenging and potentially painful process. Japan is undertaking major economic reforms to escape 25 years of sluggish domestic economic growth, while South Korea is facing some economic headwinds. The boom years are easing, and a number of major Asian economies face deep structural reform challenges that will test the skill and the courage of their policymakers. Slowing growth has implications for Australia, economically and strategically. In response to these challenges, and in addition to the reforms and responses in our domestic agenda, I have overhauled Australia's diplomatic agenda to focus on what I call economic diplomacy. Just as traditional diplomacy promotes peace, economic diplomacy promotes prosperity. This is using our diplomatic resources, networks and connections to promote trade and investment with an unprecedented focus. Indeed, our heads of mission have a KPI based on increased economic activity that they are able to generate with their host country. Sustaining our prosperity into the future will require a determined focus on global economic interests. We are an open, export-oriented market economy. Our standard of living depends upon the ability and capacity of our exporters, producers, manufacturers and service providers to find new markets or enhance existing markets for our goods and services with greater access to foreign capital. In addition to the recent successful conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the biggest trade agreement the world has seen in more than 20 years, the Australian government has also secured free trade agreements with Korea, Japan and China. These are game changers for the Australian economy, breakthrough agreements that will spur growth and give Australian exporters, large and small, the opportunity to further diversify and expand into the region. Growth is unlikely to reach the stellar heights of the recent past. However, even if growth does rebound, it's not guaranteed to lead to a more stable region. The shifting power balances in the Indo-Pacific is well underway. Increasingly, China and India's economic growth is underwriting the modernisation and growth of their militaries. Japan is taking steps to be a more normal security actor, and the United States continues to maintain a significant advantage in its strategic and defence capabilities. Weapons acquisition in Asia has seen a sustained build-up, with naval weapons being the primary focus of both purchases and intentions to acquire. China's strengthened naval capability is apparent to all, and countries in our region are also embarking on a more limited scale on programs to upgrade, enlarge and enhance the capability of their submarine fleets, while others have begun to acquire their first submarine capability. About 2/3 of Australia's trade passes through the disputed maritime zone of the South China Sea. Clearly, rising tensions between rival claimants in the South, or indeed the East China Seas, could have major implications for the region and for Australia. While we do not take sides on the competing claims, we consistently urged restraint and peaceful negotiations as a means to resolve these claims and disputes. This has been the subject of considerable discussion at regional forums in recent months, including the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asian Summit Foreign Ministers meeting. It was also an important topic of conversation during the talks that Defence Minister Marise Payne and I had with US Secretary of State John Kerry, US Secretary of Defence Ash Carter during the annual Australia-US Ministerial Consultations, or AUSMIN, in Boston last week. It is crucial that we consistently articulate our interests in the maintenance of peace and security in the region. Strategically, Australia is also committed to greater engagement with the region's institutions as a way to manage the fundamental shifts in power taking place in the Indo-Pacific. We are working with partners to particularly strengthen the East Asia Summit to entrench consultation and better equip the region to address its strategic challenges. This is the premier forum with the relevant mandate to find common ground on regional issues of concern. The important changes taking place in our region are part of a broader picture with global implications. Since Australia's earliest days, we've been the beneficiaries of alliances and relationships which have aligned with our commitment to liberal democratic rule and the values with which Australia readily identifies. The establishment of the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II has underpinned a rules-based global order. For example, under UN auspices, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, arguably the world's most important security instrument, was concluded at the height of the Cold War. The Bretton Woods Conference established a set of global institutions to better manage global financial and economic challenges. The International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later the World Bank, have been instrumental in the development of the global economy. Today, however, circumstances have changed and a greater number of states and other actors are competing for relative power. These changes are putting the multilateral system that has served us, not perfectly, but well, under significant pressure. For example, Russia's behaviour in Ukraine, its annexation of territory, military incursions and overt support for separatists reveal a contempt for the principle of state sovereignty, one of the pillars of the world order. The rise of the violent terrorist organisation Daesh is a direct challenge to the nation state, the central unit of our international order, with its claims of a caliphate over parts of the sovereign states of Syria and Iraq. Australia is one of the largest contributors to the effort to defeat Daesh in Iraq and in Syria. Not only do we foresee the disastrous consequences of a terrorist caliphate for the Middle East, we have our own security interests to protect, with a disproportionate number of Australian citizens as foreign terrorist fighters in Syria and Iraq. Empowered by the use of modern technologies and social media, Daesh is reaching out from its geographical base to encourage supporters worldwide to undermine the institutions of the state. Power and influence is diffusing to non-state actors in many parts of the world, and not only to malevolent, violent extremists who have no regard for sovereignty, borders, or fundamental human decency. In a vastly different context, wealthy individuals, NGOs, and multinational corporations can now influence the world in ways that used to be confined to those who held the reins of national governments. Many command financial resources on a scale that surpasses a number of nations. In Australia, there are unions and corporations running overt political campaigns with budgets larger than any political party could muster. And this is replicated across the world in many ways. The individual attachment to the state is eroding. In future, events overseas will increasingly influence events at home, and in many ways, national borders will no longer be physical. Nation-states will have less capacity to advance their national interests, and a larger share of the transmission of ideas, trade and financial flows will take place outside state control. I do believe the nation-state will endure, but the current global order will change, potentially quite radically. While welcoming the emergence or indeed re-emergence of countries like China, India, Indonesia and others, it would be a mistake to overlook or underestimate the ongoing value and influence of those who have underpinned stability and prosperity in our region since the end of the Second World War. It would be a folly to underestimate the ability of the United States, the world's only superpower, to continue to adapt and transform in the years ahead to maintain its status and influence. During my most recent visit to the United States, I met with executives from the tech giants Google, Twitter, HP, Microsoft. I discussed global affairs with a range of international relations experts, including the RAND Corporation, the AIIA Foundation, and from Stanford and Harvard universities, as well as within the US government. It is blindingly apparent that we are already seeing the beginning of a new wave of innovation in the United States, perhaps greater in scope and impact than previously. Revolutions in energy, shale oil and technology, 3D printing and other disruptive forms are changing the way we live and work. The capacity of big data is helping us tackle security and economic challenges in unprecedented ways. I visited one firm that is building tiny, low-cost satellites, the size of a shoebox. With high-definition lenses, they are launching them now from the International Space Station. About 50 are currently operating, and when the number of these satellites reaches 120 or beyond, they will fully photograph the Earth every 24 hours. Imagine how this can be used in mapping agriculture, water, drought, and environmental trends. Once heat and an increasing array of sensors are embedded in these nanosatellites, the information gathered will increase exponentially in value and utility. The impact of these innovations and developments will likely safeguard America's preeminent place in the world for decades to come. Nevertheless, we must be open to ongoing reform of global institutions and accept that new powers will look for alternative forums to accommodate their interests. We must engage and strengthen the forums that accommodate emerging powers and advance our interests, the G20, APEC, and the East Asia Summit. Australia has an overwhelming interest in ensuring that China's presence on the global stage is accommodated in a way that contributes to its own as well as regional and global stability. That's why we're partnering with China in areas of convergence, such as addressing the infrastructure challenge in our region. It is earlier days. However, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank can potentially make a valuable contribution to global prosperity. Already, China has embraced a number of principles that reflect the rules and standards developed by trial and error in the existing global financial institutions. However, we need to clearly understand that China and a number of other emerging powers will not be powers in our own image. This doesn't mean we should abandon the system that has served us so well in the past or compromise our values and our principles. We must stand firm and uphold what we know is right. When international law is violated, we must speak up and take appropriate action. And we make our own judgments on what is in our national interests. For example, while the P5+1 have negotiated with Iran regarding its nuclear program, with implementation subject to verification, Australia will not lift our sanctions regime until we are satisfied that Iran has met all its obligations. At 70 years of age, the United Nations is imperfect, but it remains the most effective tool we have to address global security challenges. In fact, the United Nations Security Council, while long overdue for reform to reflect new global realities, is more essential than ever. Australia has a fundamental interest in the United Nations Security Council, working to its full potential and adapting as necessary to maintain international peace and security in the face of contemporary threats that could not have been conceived at its inception. For example, Australia was able to galvanise international support and a unanimous Security Council resolution over the Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17 tragedy. We remain committed to hold those responsible for the downing of MH17 to account, and through our efforts to build and maintain international support and cooperation, we will continue to seek justice for the 38 Australians and others killed on that flight. We are proud of our record on the 2013-2014 UN Security Council. Last month, at the UN General Assembly Leaders' Week in New York, I announced that Australia would nominate to serve again on the Council for the 2029-30 term. I estimate that a G20 country like Australia should aim to serve around every 15 years, and this time frame is manageable in terms of resources and priorities. We make a significant contribution to global emergencies and the resolution of conflicts. Recently, I announced an increase in our peacekeeping commitment to the United Nations. We will stand up for our values and freedoms, rule of law, democracy, and human rights. We're prepared to defend them and to fight for them. I also announced at the UN recently that Australia will, for the first time, seek a place on the Human Rights Council for 2018-2020. We are prepared to do our part to make the world a better place. Australia must play an active role and contribute to efforts to strengthen global security and peacekeeping. We cannot afford to sit on the sidelines at a time of fundamental change. Ladies and gentlemen, Australia's foreign policy should be pragmatic. It is not a choice between pursuing either bilateral or regional or global interests. It is not a zero-sum game. In today's increasingly complex world, Australia must balance our interests across a diverse foreign policy agenda. Our immediate focus is, of course, on the Indo-Pacific. This is our neighbourhood and it will remain our primary area of interest. The Pacific is where we can do the most good and must be a focus of our efforts in terms of development. We are embracing innovation at the heart of our aid and development agenda, finding new ways to solve intractable issues, using technology, leveraging the private sector, encouraging the economic empowerment of women. However, as a top 20 country with global interests, we must engage on global issues. We have legitimate interests to advance and protect. Our success in representing Australian interests and values overseas depends on our ability to adapt to new realities nimbly, accommodate emerging powers, shape the international system and embrace new thinking. For example, I've established within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade an innovation hub called the Innovation Exchange to revolutionise the way we manage our aid budget and solve the more difficult and enduring aid and development challenges in our region. This is bringing together the brightest and most creative minds we can gather from the public sector, the private sector, and with secondments, for example, from the World Bank and from USAID. Through the Innovation Exchange, we're transforming the way we meet these challenges. Already we've gained significant private sector support, including an $80 million donation from the Michael Bloomberg's Philanthropic Fund to enable us to use the latest technologies to track previously unavailable health data so countries can target health funding and policies in ways never before possible. We cannot afford not to embrace innovation in our foreign policy. The challenge for Australia's foreign policy makers in the 21st century is to be creative and adaptive, to think laterally and embrace the future without forgetting the lessons of the past. We stand firm with our friends and allies. We are a trusted and reliable trading partner, and we can be counted on to do our fair share on the global stage for our common good. I wish you all the best for your conference.
Working? Can you hear me? The Minister has agreed to take questions. We have time for perhaps 3 questions, and I'm actually going to do 1, 2, 3 so that the roving microphones can be in place. The first one is there. Second one here. Is the one down there? No. So it's the person who had the hand up in the middle. Yes, you, Philip. Yeah. Okay. Are you happy to stand there, or would you like to sit down?
No, I'm happy to stand here.
Thank you. So could you please state your name and any affiliation, relevant affiliation?
Thank you very much, Minister. Richard Bronowski, President of AIIA New South Wales. This morning in The Australian, Kim Beazley, who's going to be our next president, made the point that he doesn't have enough staff, enough assets, really, to do the vastly expanding amount of things that he has to do in Washington on behalf of Australia. I'd suggest that across, as a former diplomat myself, I can see how the department has been eroded. Staff have left. Could you tell us, or could you assure us, given the inspiration that you've stimulated in some of us about your vision for the future, that foreign affairs is no longer going to be eroded and in fact will be reinforced? Thank you.
Richard, thank you very much for that question, and I agree with my friend and Ambassador Kim Beazley. We had a very useful couple of days together recently, and we discussed a whole range of challenges that we face, and it is true to say that over successive years, successive governments have decreased the size of DFAT. I am determined to turn that around. And in my time as Foreign Minister, which is just 2 years now, we have, for example, announced the opening of 7 new posts overseas, and I believe that is the largest number of posts to be announced at any one time for decades. And this is indicative of how I see our interests around the world. Of course, opening new posts means you need more people. We had to take some pretty tough decisions when we came to government because of the state of the budget and the necessity to find savings across our entire government budget. And so I had to be very creative and innovative in responding to the challenge that was thrown out to me by the Expenditure Review Committee. And so we took some decisions to merge AusAid into DFAT, and I believe that while it produced some savings, is actually creating exactly the kind of nimble, adaptive, innovative body that best represents our interests globally and regionally. And we have one foreign policy focus now and are able to achieve so much more, even though with less. Things like the Innovation Exchange have been able to be put together because AusAid and DFAT are one, with one power structure, one approach, and it's been an extraordinary success. In terms of losing some of our brightest to the private sector in particular, I think this is a challenge for governments around the world. I mean, the private sector offers opportunities that the public sector cannot. But I hope that by promoting the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as the premier department for international engagement, which has not been in times past, then we will continue to attract some of our best and brightest young people who will want to make a career within the Foreign Service. I also think our focus on economic diplomacy gives a whole range of people new interests and new opportunities to take part in our engagement overseas. And we've seen some very exciting outcomes with Andrew Robb's focus on these trade negotiations and securing free trade agreements. He's now got India and Europe and the Gulf Cooperation Council in his sights, and I have no doubt that he'll achieve that as well. So with the agenda that we have set out at a global, regional and bilateral level, it is ambitious and it will require support and resources. But we can also be much more creative and much more innovative in the way we engage with the world, in the way we protect and defend our interests. And already we're seeing some significant changes in our embrace of technology. We're doing much more in what they call digital diplomacy than ever before. And the exchange of ideas with other countries, I also think, is at an unprecedented level. And for a foreign minister to spend so much time in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area of San Francisco gives you an indication of where I'm seeking to take the department in the future. But I agree with you, and I'm hoping that we have a golden era for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade ahead of us. A common theme.
Thank you. Every 10 years, 50 countries outside the P5 secure membership of the Security Council. Every 15 years, 75 countries secure such membership. Isn't seeking membership every 15 years pretty modest for a country you describe as a top 20 country? Shouldn't we aspire to be a bit more frequently on the Security Council than once every 15 years.
Well,
Can I also just say, just
sorry.
as a comment, just to say, I'd just like to congratulate you on the energy, the vigour, the talent and the style you bring to the role of Foreign Minister. It's a very, very impressive performance. Everybody knows how tough a role this is, and especially the energy that you bring is most impressive.
Well, Philip. May I return the compliment, Philip, and thank you for the extraordinary energy and effort you still put into Australia's foreign relations and your deep interest in this most important sphere. It's not just a question of aspiring to be on the Security Council every 10 or 15 years. You also have to judge who is running in particular time slots and how our interests are best served. And the department and I took a very close look at what is coming in terms of candidates for the slots between now and 2030. Some countries are putting in their slot for 2045. Now, that is a long way ahead. But I felt that given a number of countries against whom we would be competing, because we're in this, I would suggest, awkward situation where we're lumped in with Western Europe and others, we're in that group. It would be different perhaps if we were in another group. Given that we're in Western Europe and others, we have to calculate how likely it is that we would win against, for example, Germany or against Switzerland, who've never been on the Security Council. So all of the slots were already filled. And I took the earliest slot where there was a vacancy. Now, of course, you can always challenge and spend a lot of time, money, resources and effort seeking to dislodge somebody who's already a country that's already put their name forward. But my criticism of the previous Labor government's commitment to get on the Security Council, and all power to them for doing it, was that the time frame that we were given taxed our department beyond necessity. We diverted resources, we diverted the aid budget, we changed foreign policy, long-held foreign policy principles, all in order to win votes to dislodge one of the two countries that had already put their names forward for that slot for the Western Europe and others. And the dislocation of effort, time, energy, resources, we're still paying the price for it today. So I think a measured approach where we can begin to secure our spot now means that we won't have to distort our efforts in such a manifestly overt way. Another government can well be more ambitious. Another government can say, to hell with it, we're going to take on Germany, Spain and France. Not France, they're already there. Germany, Spain and Liechtenstein, whatever they want to do. And that's a decision for them. But I wanted Australia's foot to be on the only space that was available for us without contest, which was 2029.
We'll have to finish then. On behalf of us all, I'd like to thank the Minister for a most comprehensive speech and then her frank response to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.